Good morning. Welcome to the second webinar in the 2020 Northwest Metastatic Breast Cancer Series. I'm Molly O'Connor, Executive Director of Komen Puget Sound, and your host for today. We are excited to bring you another great topic on clinical trials. In a normal year, remember those, this month would have marked the 5th annual Northwest Metastatic Breast Cancer Conference here in Seattle. When COVID-19 arrived, we knew we needed to go virtual if we were going to continue bringing you this important information. We're happy to bring you not just one virtual event, but a series of talks to support you with help and hope. When you registered for today's webinar, you registered for the whole series from now through October. We are also part of the 2020 Komen Virtual MBC Impact Series, a national MBC conversation, which we kicked off 2 weeks ago with hot topics in MBC presented by our own right here in Seattle, Dr. Julie Graylow. If you missed that webinar, it is available for on-demand viewing, and the link is on the homepage, in Whova, or on the Komen Puget Sound website. You can also view the complete list of webinars on the homepage of the Whova app. I would like to thank our generous sponsors who helped make this web series possible. You can visit their virtual exhibitor booths after the Q&A for today's webinar from right within the Whova platform. I encourage you to check it out and learn more about their programs and the work they are doing on metastatic breast cancer. So to our presenting sponsors, thank you, Seattle Genetics, Seattle Cancer Care Alliance, Swedish Cancer Institute. Our gold sponsors, Lilly Oncology and Novartis. Silver sponsors, AstraZeneca and Pfizer. And our supporting sponsor, Guardant Health. I would like to take a moment to thank some very hardworking souls who made this series happen. To my very own team at Komen Puget Sound, your vision and dedication are greatly appreciated. Sylvia Kennedy, Christine Zakaris, Heather Neal, Scarlett Shepard, Heidi McPhee, and Team Burns. And today's Q&A moderator, Diane Mapes of Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center. If you are active on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter, please help us get the word out about the series by sharing it with your networks. You can post on your own content using the hashtag NWMBC series and hashtag METSBC. You can also share a link to the webpage with information about the series. komenps.org/NWMBC. Everything's right there for you. So now it's with great pleasure that I introduce Dr. Hanna Linden. Dr. Linden is a medical oncologist specializing in breast cancer with expertise in endocrine therapy, clinical trials, and molecular imaging. Her clinical practice spans Seattle Cancer Care Alliance and Harborview Medical Center, and she helps patients across both organizations access clinical trials and researchers develop trials. Dr. Linden's research is focused on novel breast cancer therapies and molecular imaging techniques. Areas of particular interest and focus include the development of FES quantitative imaging to determine which patients will benefit from endocrine therapy. Dr. Linden is the co-principal investigator of EAI 142, a cooperative national trial of FES as a biomarker. She has studied the fidelity of FDG PET and experimental tracers, FES and FLT, measures of ER uptake and proliferation, as part of a collaborative U01 in the NCI's quantitative imaging network. Dr. Linden is also leading trials to determine the bioactivity of oral SERDs in development by measuring pharmacodynamic imaging. FES will likely be commercially available in 2021. And Dr. Linden has played a major role in the development of FDA approval of this tracer, which will lead to more precise and tolerable regimens for metastatic breast cancer. From her program, Project Grant in Molecular Imaging, Dr. Linden has a database of FES studies and has recently analyzed patterns in male breast cancer and lobular breast cancer and changes in quantitative ER expression in patients in treatment. In addition, Dr. Linden advocates for fellows, education, and research as the Associate Program Director of the Medical Oncology and Hematology Fellowship Program at Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center in UW-Medicine. As you listen to Dr. Linden's presentation, please submit your questions through the Q&A panel in the Whova platform. You can also vote on questions you are interested in by using the thumbs up. We want everyone to get the most out of our limited time for Q&A today. We ask that you please avoid asking questions that are unique to your special personal cancer treatment. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Hanna Linden right now.
Good morning. Thanks for making the webinar. It's really an honor to be here. I love this conference. I think it's just a great way for all of us to interact. And I'm sorry we can't be actually together in person, but I'm really glad that we have other ways of connecting. This is a topic that I'm very passionate about. Clinical trials are just an incredibly important piece of how we make things better for patients. But I want to offer one disclaimer right at the start, which is I care a lot about clinical trials. I care a lot about research. I want to make things better, but I also care about patients. And I don't think anybody should be in a clinical trial if they don't want to be. If you're not comfortable with a clinical trial, it may not be the right answer for you. I'm not trying to advertise or coerce. I think the key issue for all of us when we present clinical trials is that we want to tell people what would be the standard option and what would be an option on a trial and give people real choices about how they get their care. It's a generous act to be on a clinical trial. I think some people truly enjoy it and really benefit, but it's not something that you have to do. And if for whatever reason you don't feel comfortable with a clinical trial, it's okay to not join a trial. It's also okay to leave a trial because, then we would still be learning things about essentially the tolerability of the logistics and the reality of the treatment on the trial. But with that, I do plan to be enthusiastic about this topic. So why? Why do we do clinical trials? Well, we want to keep people safe. We want to do the best thing for patients. And we also want to improve many facets of patient care, including how long you survive and how long a treatment works. And this is our way of making those incremental improvements. It's a broad term, clinical trial, and we're going to talk a little bit about this because there are qualitative things that are important to do as well. There are observational trials. There are all kinds of things beyond just the standard thing we all think of with a clinical trial. But what we're really trying to do with the clinical trial is advance the standard of care, make things go better for people subsequently and currently by trying novel approaches. So clinical trials have made a huge difference in the way we take care of people. As I think many people know, we used to remove all your axillary nodes and do what's called a modified radical, we used to do a radical mastectomy. We now do what's called a modified radical mastectomy. But, the people who first started treating breast cancer surgically thought it was better if we took more. And we now know that that's not at all important, but we had to learn that by actually doing a trial where half the people got the standard of care and half at that time, and the other half got the lesser treatment. And I think meaning less invasive treatment, not less good treatment. But that's how we test things. And I think we all think about it as if we're going to make things better, you're going to have to take more treatment. But actually many trials offer less treatment as a way to test whether that's going to be as effective as the more aggressive approach. And I think we all know now that sentinel node biopsy is very appropriate for most people. And we all know that you don't need to take the pectoralis muscle in order to do a mastectomy. But these are things that have happened in the past that have helped us get to where we are. Tamoxifen and aromatase inhibitors have been tested. And, when I first started doing this, we didn't understand that estrogen receptor positivity drove that decision. We thought it was actually age. So if you were postmenopausal, you got endocrine therapy. And if you were premenopausal, you got chemotherapy. And that was completely wrong. And clinical trials have taught us these important things, as well as, gotten us the more modern therapies that we're using now, the CDK4/6 inhibitors like palbociclib and abemaciclib, the PI3 kinase inhibitors like alpelisib. And for triple negative tumors, we now have sacituzumab govitecan, great new drug. We have immune therapy for people who have PD-L1 expression or MS high. And for HER2-directed therapy, we have these game-changing treatments, all of which happen because people participated in clinical trials. So clinical trials have gotten us very, very far and can take us farther. So these are just a couple graphs, had to put in some technical slides here, showing that if you don't get the tamoxifen, you don't do as well. And what's interesting, frankly, about these studies, I actually should have updated them. These go out actually 30 years now. And what's very interesting, you can see when you look at the curves here, is the curves are actually dividing more as we go out in time. And people only took the tamoxifen for 5 years. So this is the magic trick of tamoxifen or aromatase inhibitor therapy. They work really well, but they work even after you've invested in the 5 years of taking them. So people who participated in these trials and then agreed to keep talking to us for many years and be followed up for up to 30 years have shown this huge benefit of anti-estrogen therapy. And as I alluded to earlier, if you're not estrogen receptor positive, that tamoxifen doesn't really help you. So this is a slide showing work from the what's called the Oxford Overview, which is a huge group looking at a meta-analysis, an analysis of multiple trials from multiple countries done at multiple periods of time, all of which taken together show these important findings. The other, I think, huge piece of news while I've been practicing is trastuzumab, Herceptin. This is a gigantic difference in outcome between the people who got Herceptin and didn't get Herceptin. When we started giving it as adjuvant treatment, we all knew it was really promising in the metastatic setting, and we're still learning many more things about HER2-directed therapy. But this is the adjuvant study where there's a huge difference between how the people who were randomized to receive this new drug that has some toxicity, could have caused some heart failure, actually improved outcomes, and again, durably improved outcomes. We're curing more people because we're using that drug. It's not as if you did a little better, but then over time, the disease came back. This is a huge improvement. So these are some of the bigger pieces of news in clinical trials in breast cancer in the recent past. So the challenge, I think, for all of us to get our head around is, when is it reasonable to do a trial, and when should you just do something standard? And so realize that for any clinical trial that's available, it's gone through a lot of discussion and review, and multiple committees have had to say it's a fair trial. And where that really starts is that experts get together and argue with each other in a spirited fashion with advocates in the room to help us figure out what's really going to be safe. And we have a term for this, which is equipoise. And what that means is you feel equivalent about the two things. So you've got to feel like it's safe to do a trial. And, in the past, in the United States of America, some very bad things happened with what was called clinical research. And we just don't do that anymore. What happened with Tuskegee is illegal now and could never even start to get through a review. So when you're thinking about a trial, you shouldn't be thinking that we're conducting research as if it was the 1930s or the 1940s. We're in a very different world here, and we don't do things unless multiple lines of experts, and that includes patients, have said that they think it's a fair trial. So when we think about trials, I think most people always think you're going to get one thing or you're going to get another, and there's going to be a randomization. And actually, all trials aren't like that. But a phase 3 trial is like that. And the trials that I just talked about did involve people getting a standard therapy, and then they got an additional therapy. And there was a time 30 years ago when tamoxifen was an additional therapy. And there was a time, a little more recent, but still pretty far back now, where we thought that we didn't know that Herceptin was going to be an effective adjuvant therapy. So at the time of the trial, it has to be deemed fair and safe because we can't do harm. We already have pretty good treatments for breast cancer. We can't add an unacceptable downside for patients. So we think a lot about this equipoise question, and there's a lot of room for arguing about it. But we have many options and that we know can really help patients. We have to sort of choose from that menu and think about a sequence. There is an issue of FDA approval. Is the drug going to be covered? And so we sometimes have to confine the next type of trial to what the FDA thinks is appropriate now. And this is about, whether the insurer is going to be willing to pay for a drug if you prove that it's better than what is currently FDA approved. So a few examples. I think the most common situation is we give 2 or 3 arms of a study, you enroll in a study and everybody gets the same safe and proven treatment, meaning no true placebo arm. No, you're not getting therapy, but you don't know that you're not getting therapy. So, for example, right now, one of the hot topics in breast cancer is the CDK4/6 inhibitors. Should we give them adjuvantly, or do they cause too many side effects? So 3 companies have sponsored 3 different trials. One is still not reported, where you get chemotherapy and anti-estrogen therapy and radiation surgery. You get all the things that we know are going to help you. But then half of the patients do get a sugar pill, a placebo, and half get a CDK4/6 inhibitor. I think those drugs are toxic enough that everybody knows who's on treatment. But officially, the physician and the patient are blinded. When I'm in that situation with the patient, we talk about their side effects because I need to ask and I need to manage them. And I tell people, I don't know officially, but I think you're on the drug, or I don't know officially, I don't think you're on the drug, because I have to be honest with people. And it's my job to tell them what's going on. But when I put a patient on that type of a double-blind study, I'm as blinded as they are. That's how the rules go. But when we do a study like that, the patients in the control arm are getting the same complete therapy that we think is standard of care. And it would be unethical to do a study where we gave them anything less. So in this country and at our institutions in Seattle, we only do studies like that. We don't do a study where we expose people to the risk of not getting treatment. Now, that means that we exclude people who have declined standard treatment. So there's some people where they don't want a traditional treatment, they only want an untraditional treatment, and they're not going to be eligible for a study because the study is going to demand that they get complete and thorough care, giving them the best chance of either cure or long-term survival. So the other kind of study that we think about, which is more like a phase 2, and we'll talk about that in a minute, is where there are lots of options for you. Probably you're going to see most of those therapies in the future, but there's something really promising right now that's available on a study. And so what you're agreeing to when you do that is an open label of the drug. There isn't a placebo. You're just going to get this promising treatment, and you're going to be a test pilot and try it out. And in that setting, there are going to be a lot of safety features factored in to make sure that you're doing okay and that you're comfortable and that your side effects are managed. And we tend to image people more frequently in this setting than you would if you were not on a trial. And the real reason there is we don't want to waste your time. If the treatment isn't working, we want to measure something and make sure that you can not be treated with the study agent and get back on a standard therapy. So there are many different types of trials, and I haven't comprehensively listed them here, but I think most people think there's only a phase 3 trial where you're randomized to something or not getting it. But that's not actually how it works. We have many studies that are, that can be more observational. We also study devices and imaging. So you might test a new device that positions you differently in a scanner, and we might ask you whether or not you are comfortable. We've also done studies that are just of supportive care. So, for example, one of my favorite ones to quote is that we got to participate in as one site, which was an acupuncture study. So it was about the joint aches that people get with the aromatase inhibitor, and you were randomized to true acupuncture or sham acupuncture given by an expert, meaning difficult to tell that it wasn't real. And then after the 12 weeks of the study, the people who were in either arm were given a coupon for acupuncture, and of course that was standard acupuncture, not sham. So you can actually participate in a study that has nothing to do with the therapy, but might have a lot to do with your quality of life. And we have done studies of financial toxicity, for example. How do you share information with patients in a way that helps them maximize their finances when they're going through a traumatic event like cancer treatment, and you want to make sure that they get the most care. It's well known that people who have financial pressures on them don't do as well as people who have better coverage for either their care or other life expenses during cancer treatment. So we've done an informational study where we offered financial counseling to people, and this, of course, was not blinded or placebo controlled in any way. So there are different types of studies, and there may be studies that you haven't really thought you might be able to participate in. Okay, but for treatment, there are these three phases of studies that we think about. There's phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. And phase 1 is when we're looking at drug safety. So you might feel like, well, that's not a good idea because I don't even know if the drug is active against my cancer. Actually, in the era of molecularly targeted agents, when we're checking safety and we're going to start at a low dose and then ramp up to a high dose, often the lowest dose is very active. So it's not just safety. We certainly are looking for a signal of drug efficacy in the phase 1 setting. But phase 1 is usually a bigger commitment of time because we're often doing blood levels and testing some other findings rather than just feeling confident that we don't need to measure everything so closely. So I think the phase 1 trials can be a little bit more cumbersome for the patient in terms of the number of visits, but it does get you access to a novel agent. And I think that's very appealing for people to try something new for their cancer, especially if they're in a situation where the standard therapies aren't working as well. Phase 2 is when you're testing a promising agent for activity. There can be a control arm in phase 2, or it can be just a straight up phase 2. And one example that we've done is we tested a different dosing schedule of a drug, proven FDA approved safe drug. We actually wanted to test whether giving a lower dose and at a shorter frequency, but an overall lower dose would be effective. And I think in a way those can be very fun trials for patients. But it still was a study. We didn't know if it was going to work. We just all thought it was going to work. And in that case, it did pan out. But, of course, all studies aren't positive. Phase 3 is when you're actually looking for FDA approval and you've got a larger study and there is a randomization in there. There can be multiple randomizations. And, one study that I put a lot of patients on involved simply one brand of aromatase inhibitor versus another. And we knew that both were very active. So I felt like it was really very safe. And of course, patients were eager to go on a study like that when the aromatase inhibitors were not generic and they were very expensive. So it was a nice opportunity for patients. So phase 3 doesn't necessarily mean that you're not going to get something. But it often does mean that there is some blinding and there's some, you're not sure whether you're getting all the things or not. And it's something that gets revealed at a later date. So a phase 3 study that I actually put a number of patients on involved clodronate versus placebo, a bone stabilizing drug in the adjuvant setting. And again, in that study, most of my patients had a sense of whether or not they were on or not because they got some GI side effects from the clodronate. But I felt like that was a really safe study for patients to participate in and one that many could feel good about. So the barriers to trial, which is sort of the meat of what I'm here to talk about. I'm sure many of you can come up with other barriers, but here's a list that I've been aware of, mostly as I talk to patients. I think really the biggest problem for patients with their cancer care and with the trial is about time and money. What truthfully people do when they participate in a trial is they're donating their time, which costs them money. Even if we reimburse your parking, and even if we reimburse your gas money, we often can't reimburse your spouse or your friend who brought you to the center for your extra test. So there's a cost, and I think that's really what's often the most prohibitive for people. And now with the COVID pandemic, they're just worried if they have to come in more often that they're putting themselves more at risk. Which brings me to the second major barrier, which is this whole perception of risk. On one hand, everything has a risk, but obviously it's a study, so there is some more risk. I think when we write studies and these studies are reviewed carefully, we make sure that we factor in any concerns about risk. So if we know the drug might have a risk of lung inflammation, we test you more frequently for early signs of that, so we would detect it in a timely fashion and be able to interrupt that process. So, for example, one of the CDK4/6 inhibitors, ribociclib, may have some issues with conduction of the heart. And so we, in the studies, we did a lot of EKGs in those patients. So that was a nuisance for the patients who participated, but there are safety features that we build in. And we watch very carefully. Anybody can have an allergic reaction to a drug. And so, the first time you ingest an agent on a study, we're going to have you hang out for a little bit and make sure you're doing okay. I do think that between the time and expense and the risk perception, these are the ones that really deter people from participating. And I think you have to kind of think about whether you're comfortable with the equipoise, the evenness and balanced perception, or whether or not, you feel like the risk is worth it, because you do get extra care. I don't mean to insinuate that everybody needs extra care, but I think some patients really find the extra attention to be rewarding. They like to be watched more closely. And as one famous New York Times columnist said when he participated in a clinical trial, "I'm not a lab rat, I'm a test pilot." He appreciated having his input taken seriously. If the drug made him nauseated or made him feel queasy, he could tell them and they could figure out whether it's safe to take whichever anti-nausea medicine with it, and it will help others have a better experience with the drug when it's commercially available. There are a couple other important barriers, I think, to talk about, and that includes the complexity of the study, how complicated the study is, and whether or not it's available at a site near you. There are studies you'll find out about on the internet and you can't get there. We've worked with different agencies like Make-A-Wish to get people to studies, but I think this is a true barrier. If you live in a rural area or you don't live near a major city, you're not going to maybe have access to a trial, and everybody can't fly themselves across the country in order to participate in a trial. And even if you can afford to fly yourself across the country once for that opinion, you're not going to want to fly out there once a week for your study appointments. So I think that can be a problem. On the realm of complexity, I don't think anybody understands the consent form that well. I think, we've kind of outdone ourselves there with how complex we've made things. And so I think it is a bit of a leap of faith. I think we can do better, but we certainly earnestly sit and listen to people's concerns and questions before we put them on a trial. And we really try to make sure that those questions get answered and that it's really spelled out kind of what's going to be required of you for participating in the trial. Number of extra visits and what will be happening at those visits. Is it going to be a blood draw? Is it going to be an EKG? Or is it going to be a scan or what's involved? But I do think the complexity can be a bit overwhelming. So here are some things that we've done to overcome those barriers. One of them is that we've done imaging trials looking at, for example, PET imaging, but also MRI, where you're just getting an extra scan, and that's sort of it. You're not getting multiple extra scans, and you're not agreeing to an extra treatment. We've also worked really hard to make sure that there's coverage for your time and uncovered expenses, meaning if you're spending a day with us getting 8 extra blood draws, we have to pay for your parking, your meals, and your transportation for that day. We can't pay you. That's not ethical. And so, we have to be careful about this. I think some people think that we can cover gaps that we can't cover, but I think it's very reasonable to reimburse you for your time as best we can. The other issue is getting you proactively getting you coverage, and also making sure we have options for things like we have a fit and move study that's really just about exercise. We've done financial toxicity. We have other trials that really don't involve an additional risk of the flavor of taking an extra medicine. In addition, we do have, for people who have a language barrier, ideally we have everything translated, but for some rare languages that is not possible. And we have another option, which is there's a half page in the patient's native language, and then we have a professional interpreter go over the entire consent, translating it with the patient. So just to advertise some trials we have here and now, and then I'd be happy to take questions. For triple negative patients, we have a CGen product that's directed against a novel epitope called LIV1. This is a very active compound. It does cause a little bit of neuropathy, but it's a very exciting drug, I think, and we are now coupling it with immune therapy in first-line triple negative disease, and I think that's an exciting trial for patients. It's a drug we actually have a fair amount of experience with. We're also, everybody's excited about immune therapy, so we have a synergy drug that we're looking at for patients with HER2-directed therapy and immune therapy in the third-line setting. We also have multiple trials of oral SERDs for patients for anti-estrogen therapy. This is the idea here is that we'd like to replace the need for the injection of the fulvestrant and also have it be a better drug, really, with better availability at the tumor site. These are really low toxicity therapies, and they're given with a CDK4/6 inhibitor because that's become our standard of care. We also have a phase 1 study of a next generation CDK inhibitors. The study that I wanted to make sure we talked about are a couple imaging trials we have. We've done estrogen receptor PET, FES PET, and helped to get that FDA approved. That we're looking at in the stage 4 setting, first line. There's a subgroup of patients that really needs more data. They get excluded from most studies because they have bone dominant disease that's so challenging to measure. And we think that FDG PET is going to be a good treatment for them to assess lytic lesions, a good measuring device. So this study will pay for FDG PET to be used for these patients to measure their response. We also have studies with CAR T cells, PARP inhibitors, and tumor vaccines. And I think I mentioned the Fit and Move study earlier. So I think my time's up, but I'd be happy to answer your questions, and I really appreciate your attention.
Hi, folks. This is Diane Mapes. I'm the moderator for this Q&A with Dr. Hanna Linden. Some of you may know me as Double Whammied. I work as a writer at Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Institute or Center, which is where Hanna does her research. Thank you very, very much for that spectacular presentation on clinical trials, access, and navigation, Hannah. That was really terrific. And we do have a handful of questions here for you. I'm going to get started on the question about imaging studies that you just mentioned on the FES PET and the FDG PET. This has to do with lobular breast cancer patients who are often, as you know, diagnosed late because lobular tends to not grow in a lump. So are there new imaging studies, new tools to help lobular patients get better diagnosis, imaging at the start, or to be able to stage them and find all the METs if they're present?
Yeah, good question, and obviously one close to my heart. We've actually got a paper that we're trying to get published here showing that MRI is actually pretty effective at our center when you're early stage lobular. But it doesn't answer that question of, are your lymph nodes involved and are there distance? So we're working on that. If you already know you have advanced lobular cancer, you are probably a candidate for the oral SERD studies. You're probably a candidate for EAI 1183, the serial FDG PET study. And if you're newly diagnosed, you're a candidate for the FES study. Our work in FES actually is going to lead to this being commercially available. So it also may be that come January or February, you can get an FES scan if you and your doctor think that would help with your treatment planning. Notably, I think helping you figure out whether you want to stay on endocrine therapy or whether you want to jump to chemotherapy. So I think we actually do have a few advances here, and we do have some imaging studies, and mercifully the imaging is paid for by the studies. So for the bone dominant study, you get the FDG PET is paid for by the study. And for the oral SERD studies, the FES is actually paid for by the study. And there was another question in there I saw about whether if you're already on Palbo, are you a candidate for the oral SERD study? And you are, but it's going to be an oral SERD with Palbo. And that might not be the choice you'd want. Maybe you'd want to be on abemaciclib, but these drugs have a lot of drug-drug interactions, so we can't just interchange that. So on the oral SERD studies, when you get the Palbo, it is free. It's provided also by the study.
Someone has asked about the FES trial. Is it open now, and what's the name of it? How would they be able to find it?
Yeah, so the national study is EAI 142, and it is open now. It's only open at centers that can make their own FES, so that's us and nobody else in the region. I guess the people in Vancouver, BC can do it, but we're not allowed to Canada yet. That once it's commercially available, will be open at multiple sites. What I'm also telling you is that at our center, FES is embedded in some of the SERD trials. So you're signing up for two studies, basically. You're signing up to get the oral SERD, and you're also going to get serial FES so we can see if it's blocking.
Here's another question from someone who is very close to entering a clinical trial. It's a new drug, very new. She says, I will be among the first participants. How can I cope with the fear that something might go wrong?
Yeah, this is a really hard, this is where it's really complicated and I think tough. And one way you can cope with the fear is you cannot do it. I mean, I think you have to always know that you don't have to do this. We're not supposed to coerce you into anything. But I think what you want to know is when we're giving these trials and they're the first in human studies, we're extremely careful. There are a lot of guardrails set up to keep you safe. And there's a lot of attention being paid to side effects, and we monitor them extremely closely so that we can intervene if there's a problem. I think what I was trying to say in the talks is, there is a risk, but it is not this huge jumping off a cliff risk. The drugs have been tested for safety, and the consent form can sound a little bit foreboding, but if you were to look up, the potential side effects of aspirin and ibuprofen and acetaminophen, Tylenol, those potential side effects would seem really frightening as well. So I think sometimes we go overboard on that consent. And I think you can take it day by day and see how you feel.
That is great information, Hannah. Thank you so much. Here's a question about the new normal that we're all going through right now with COVID pandemic. And what are the measures that are being taken now during this pandemic to ensure patient safety during clinical trials and doctor visits?
Right. So I think this is a tough one. And I think it is why a lot of people aren't signing up for a trial right now, is because trials do require more frequent visits. So you're going to have more touches with the medical system and more interactions with people. That being said, I do think that most medical establishments are safer than the grocery store. We screen heavily. We expect you to behave, meaning, wear your mask, not come in with a fever, all those like key important aspects of behavior we expect you to follow. And the trials have lightened up a little bit. They used to require a lot of visits. And if the visit could be done by telemed, the trial's allowing us to do it by telemed now. So there are modifications that we're making to make this more reasonable for patients. And I do think that, COVID has really frightened people from just getting routine medical care. And so they're not getting their screening mammogram, they're not getting their screening colonoscopy, they're not getting, their blood work and their blood pressure checked. And that's actually not very safe. Getting routine care is fine, and you can all get your flu shots and you're going to be fine. But still, respect the system. And so if it's just a routine blood draw and you have a fever, you're not going to come in for that until your fever's down. I mean, until we sort of figure it out, maybe get you a COVID test before you come back in the building. And all of us are working really hard on this to make healthcare continue to be safe. And in Seattle, this has actually gone quite well. The data are that, there is not a huge amount of transmission happening in the hospital.
That is great information, Hannah. I appreciate that. Here's a question about the acupuncture study that you mentioned earlier with regard to patients who had aromatase inhibitor joint pain. And I think that this is the study that was Heather Greenlee and Don Hirschman out of Columbia that I wrote about actually for Fred Hutch.
Yeah, no, I just love that study. And that was when Heather was actually still in New York that we started it, but it got us acupuncture. So that study was positive. It improved the joint aches. And that's really a nice example of that is now covered. Getting acupuncture for the joint aches of AIs or menopause. And I just really love that treatment because it doesn't interact with anything else. And it's, you're not having taken medicine and it makes you feel better. So that was a fantastic study that we were able to participate in. And we are so lucky to have Heather Greenlee now at our center. And she's the one who's behind the whole Fit and Move study, or Eat and Move, I think that's what it's called. Sorry. But basically it's a study that, tells you how to cook healthy meals at home and get moving and gives you a Fitbit.
That's fascinating. And I'm actually going to ask you to dig into that a little bit more. I know Heather Greenlee is doing research through the Cook for Your Life website, which offers really healthy recipes for cancer patients and their caregivers. So the Fit and Move study is on exercise and diet then?
And it is, based on that website, and you get a Fitbit. And I believe the study randomizes you about the frequency of interventions. And this whole thing was set up before COVID. So then of course we couldn't get people in groups and we had to kind of regroup. And so now it's a virtual, it's a web-based study. It was originally going to be set up to get you in a gym together and get you in a cooking class together, but now they're doing it over the web. So we had to adapt, but I think it's a great study. And, the truth of it is we can all eat better and we can all exercise more, and you're going to do better if you do that. You're going to have fewer heart attacks and you're going to have improved breast cancer related survival.
And exercise is beneficial, not just for early stage breast cancer patients or for people before they're diagnosed. Exercise is really beneficial for metastatic breast cancer patients who are always in treatment.
Right, unfortunately, that's right. But, maybe when you get your acupuncture so that your side effects are a little better, you can get back out there and exercise. And there's sane ways to do that. It's not that you're going to go to boot camp and get ground into the, into the turf and then think you're going to get back up and enjoy exercising the next day. It's, it's gentle exercise and building up your stamina so that, you have more strength and you can frankly tolerate treatment better.
And that's great for metastatic patients. To have a study that they can participate in to test exercise benefit on their disease. Here's one more question, Hannah, on CDK. If you're already on a CDK4 inhibitor, a CDK inhibitor, I guess, can you still participate in the oral SERD study?
Yeah, you can, but you're probably going to get the same CDK4/6 inhibitor with it. And see, these are the questions we just don't know, because CDK4/6 inhibitors have just ambushed the strategies in metastatic breast cancer, and now we're all giving them early line, and we don't understand whether or not it's something that should be followed by the same CDK4/6 inhibitor with a different endocrine partner, or should you switch? And the answer is not known. So yes, you can, after we are giving CDK after CDK4/6 inhibitor, and the palbo on that study is covered.
Here's a question that has to do with sort of a mixed breast cancer types. Do you know of any trials for those with concurrent triple negative breast cancer and ER positive HER2 negative lesions with several PIK3CA mutations? A lot going on.
Oh, wow. No, I don't, because that's what's hard. This actually, we didn't talk about this. It's a great question. What do you do if you don't fit the exact definition? And the answer is you don't get in the study. That's what's really frustrating. If you have a particularly unusual situation, the study will often not allow you to enter because it's too confusing. And the reason is they have an endpoint that they're trying to get at. And so they want to know if people with PIK3 mutations respond to therapy. They don't want to know if people with PIK3 mutations and HER2 mutations respond to therapy. They're answering one narrow question, and this is where studies are a little bit rigid. So I think the real question there is what should you base your therapy on? And you got to try to pick kind of the worst driver, I think, and base your therapy on that. And so that this is just a clinical judgment thing. Now, that being said, a person with that situation could be in the serial FDG monitoring study, because that's an imaging study, as long as they're getting a standard FDA approved therapy. But no perfect answer. I think, if you have multiple mutations in the PI3 kinase mutation in the PI3K pathway, you may respond to alpelisib. You may respond. Remember, everolimus is really that pathway too. So there are multiple options. But the question you're asking, which is just a fantastic question, is what if I don't fit? And the answer is, that's where our clinical judgment comes in. And that's really annoying, but true. Most studies are pretty rigid about this, and it's just because at the end of the day, they want to have an explanation for their findings. And so they're a little bit sticky about these definitions.
Thank you so much, Hannah. I think we have time for maybe just one or two more questions. With regard to not fitting into a trial, not kind of being in between, I know that this has come up a lot with lobular patients who are trying to get into trials and they cannot measure their disease. They cannot spot their disease. So it makes it tough for them to enter clinical trials. What help can you offer?
Yeah, well, but that was why I was advertising this PET trial, is that this has driven us crazy for so long. These people with bone dominant lytic lesions that obviously are just like every other breast cancer, but there isn't a resist measurable thing. This has just been a horrible thing. And really, there are a ton of patients like this. And so they've been excluded from clinical trials, which is ridiculous. So that is why Jen Specht and Heather J. Seen and Dave Minkoff and my friends at ECOG Akron wrote that trial. And it's the answer for you on that. Now, it's not perfect, because everybody, again, we have to have these niches. So if you have that non-measurable stuff, but you also have measurable stuff, then we're going with the measurable stuff. And you're actually not a candidate for the trial. But if you're one of these bone dominant people who doesn't have measurable disease, you can go on that study while you're just getting whatever treatment is indicated, whether it's a PARP inhibitor or whether it's trastuzumab or whether it's chemotherapy or whether it's endocrine therapy. You are eligible for that trial because we really want to fix this issue. And we're not going to use this resist measurement. We're going to use something called persist, meaning that's the pet part. And we're going to measure the SUV of the lesions and see if they go down with treatment. Truthfully, anybody with bone dominant cancer knows that really what happens is they respond to most treatments, but then they have a new lesion. But PET is probably a little bit better at detecting that new lesion sooner because of that lytic component. So we actually saw this as a huge problem in metastatic breast cancer, and we're going to fix it. And I think it's going to help people with lobular tumors. I think it's going to help people with bone dominant tumors. And I hope we're going to change the world and make it so that in the future, PET will be covered for these patients on study. And I will tell you that on the SERD studies, the PET's covered, the oral SERDs, for the same reason, because it's a really common situation in ER positive disease.
That is amazing. Hanna, thank you so much for all of your hard work on all the research that you do and helping patients. I think we have just about come to the end.
All right, well, let me thank
our
Coleman
session.
and thank you guys for organizing this. I think, I mean, I'm so sorry we can't be together, but the Metastatic Breast Cancer Coalition is just a great group, and I'm really appreciative of you all supporting us and supporting each other and being there. And I'm so glad that at least we could have something happen, even though there's a pandemic.
Thank you.
That was amazing. Thank you, Dr. Linden, for being real about clinical trials and for making this information so accessible to those listening today. I just want to hit a couple more items before I turn all of you loose to visit the exhibitor booths and community boards. I'd like to thank our speaker, Dr. Hanna Linden, our Q&A monitor, Diane Mapes, the team at Come Puget Sound, and of course, all of you. This series is for you, and we hope you feel it was time well spent today. And we would, again, really appreciate it if you shared this presentation and let others know that we're having these conversations right now, and that even if they missed today, videos are still available for them to go back and watch. Finally, shortly after the end of today's webinar, you will receive an email with a link to an evaluation. We would appreciate your feedback on today's webinar and the series as a whole. And then we encourage you to visit the virtual exhibitor booths and see what the event sponsors have to share with you. You can also visit the community boards, which are a place where you can engage in discussion with your fellow attendees on a variety of METS related topics. And you can even create a topic of your own. These boards are available 24/7, so we encourage you, encourage your continued engagement through these boards. This concludes our today's program. Again, on behalf of Come Puget Sound, thanks for spending some of your day with us. We look forward to having you with us at the next webinars. Stay safe, stay connected, and have a great day. Thanks.